behaviors that allowed them to be successful in one, moment and situation, what's going to allow them to be successful as they either go through increasing their scope or dealing with a new CEO who has new ways of doing things, or a merger where cultures are coming together. And so we do all of that through this group and peer-based coaching approach. So one to many is our way of doing things. So it's great to be here again for the third, and then we've got one more week to go next week. But we thought we'd find out a little bit in terms of who's on the call with us, so that we can kind of tailor our comments. I know we've had a mix of folks that are inside their organization and folks that are outside their organization. So let's take a look and see who's with us today. Our goal with all of these sessions is really to help you get what you need for your practice. And so you can let us know throughout as Lisa and I are kind of taking you through the content today, what questions you have and what would you like us to spend more time on. We'll see who's with us, so we get a bit of a sense of who's in the room. I think that everybody should be able to see the panel, or poll, yep. I should say, panel, poll.
Yeah, we've got just a couple more people to put in their responses. Let us know, and then I'll launch this in just a sec. All right, so let's share the results here.
All right, it's a bit of a mix. Got some external folks, internal HR talent, and then line leaders, so that's great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you answered other, let us know what your role is.
Mm-hmm. In the chat. So today's topic that, as Lisa and I were thinking about, all of the different ways we sort of look at, coaching and mentoring, and really coaching and mentoring is just a kind of a tool and application around getting learning into organizations. We're thinking a lot, and we called this particular session, why business needs to get personal. And one of the things that has really struck me since we've been in COVID and navigating this global pandemic was just how comfortable leaders have had to get with talking about emotion and dealing with emotion at work, because this has been a very emotional time for many of us as we've been, learning how to navigate. I don't know about any of you on the call here, but certainly I did not receive my handbook on how to lead during a pandemic. It's been quite the roller coaster ride for myself and my team. And one of the things that I was really noticing, and can be interested to hear kind of Lisa's perspective on this, but as we were going through, this pandemic started, and we had some programs that were going, some of our group coaching programs that were going with leaders, and the piece that I saw just really kind of come to the forefront was this need that we had to connect and talk about the human experience that we were having. And, as organizations were really clamoring to figure out what I would call almost the hygiene factors, how are people going to work from home, and are they set up to work from home, and what are we going to do about getting everybody out of the office? Where we, saw people needing the support was on navigating the emotional highs and lows of dealing with isolation, dealing with social distancing, dealing with uncertainty, dealing with, some pretty dramatic things that were happening in a very compressed period of time. And so we had actually in our community opened up some calls just for our community to be able to come together and share experiences and exchange ideas. And it really got me personally reflecting on the fact that we often don't create a lot of that space in organizations. And as we think about, our learning programs for leaders, and as we think about any sort of, education piece that we're putting into organizations, we're often, thinking about the learning outcomes and what the business needs. But this pandemic experience has really, to me, brought up the need for us to look at the whole person through an experience. And as we're looking at the organizations that we're working with now, those that have really created space and opportunity for leaders to process what's been going on and then come up with ways to plan and action and move forward has been really powerful. So that was kind of a theme that we were curious about, and curious to hear what you guys are seeing. But Lisa, what's been your kind of observation on this personal side of business and in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, a lot of, and I have to apologize. I have a dog who's barking at the mailman, so forgive me. That's why I was muted before. This is what happens when you work from home. Um, uh, the personal side's really, really interesting because a lot of people have been talking now, particularly in this virtual world, about how are we going to maintain our culture? How are we going to find people who are cultural fits, and that kind of thing? And specifically in the work that we do, Glyne, the coaching and mentoring, how are we going to gauge chemistry, right?
Mhm.
And so I have various answers to that. I mean, when we talk about organizational culture, one of the things that I learned recently that I think is really powerful is not to be thinking about cultural fit, but to be thinking about cultural add,
Hmm.
right?
What do you mean by that? Cultural
Yeah.
act?
So a culture, we're so often we look for cultural fit, and we're looking for people who are like us,
Mhm.
right? And there's a real danger in that when you talk about trying to have an inclusive, diverse, work environment that values diverse thinking. So always encouraging organizations to think about cultural add. And I mention that, I know we're not talking about organizational culture broadly in this conversation, but I mention it because I think it's a good segue to talking about this idea of chemistry, right?
Mhm.
Which we so often, particularly in the mentoring program context, when you're talking about formal mentoring, organizations are worried about matching people who have chemistry as if that's the secret sauce,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And it's true, chemistry there, chemistry's, you know when it's there, but it doesn't mean that it can't necessarily, it doesn't mean that it can't be developed.
Mhm.
And too often it's another term really just for this idea of matching like with like,
Mhm.
and recognizing that the chemistry that can be developed among people who have some differences is really important. So we have a question for all of you, a couple questions actually on this idea of chemistry. Here they are. First one is, how critical do you think personal chemistry is when it comes to one-on-one mentoring? And the second one is, how critical do you think chemistry is when it comes to a group coaching or group mentoring program? We'd love to hear your answers.
I think chemistry and it is this whole notion of interpersonal relationships and how we cultivate these interpersonal relationships. Chemistry always comes up as one of the factors that people talk about. And I love this idea of cultural add in the sense of culture. I think I read somewhere once that, your culture works for you at a certain size, and then beyond a certain size, to have too much of a homogeneous culture actually works to your disadvantage as an organization. So it's kind of interesting when we bring that into the one-to-one context and then the smaller group context. So I'm interested to see what people
Yeah,
say in the
absolutely.
poll.
So this is really neat to me. So when we're talking about one-on-one mentoring, most of the folks think that it's extremely critical, and some think somewhat critical. Nobody thinks it's not at all critical. When we're talking about a group coaching or group mentoring program, one person thought it was not at all critical, others thought somewhat critical. So people seem to think it's less critical in a group context and more critical in a one-on-one context. What do you make of that?
So speaking from the group perspective, it is interesting. What I would say about chemistry and fit is that you need to have a majority. So if you have somebody who's really that odd person out, and I guess I'm thinking about it really in the context of difficult personalities, because that's often what you get into with groups.
Mm-hmm.
You have that kind of that one or two difficult personalities or people who are a little bit more challenged in a group setting. They cannot form the majority of your group in a group coaching experience, because if they do, they have the tendency to swing the group in a direction that you don't want to go in, has been my experience. So I do think to some degree chemistry is important, but you can overcome the natural chemistry, that, because to me chemistry is different than styles, right? Chemistry, like, we can have different styles but have good chemistry. Whereas if there's something that, somebody just really, their value system is very different than the majority of the people in the groups, that can cause a different kind of energy around chemistry. And that's where, some people just, in my own experience, they're just not great group players. They don't typically, or I shouldn't say typically, maybe their group coaching programs just aren't for them. They're really not interested in being part of a group, giving of themselves, being vulnerable in front of a group of people. And that's where that sort of, impacts a group overall. So I don't know,
Yeah.
what do you think in terms of one-to-one and your own experience with group? Because I know you do group coaching too.
Yeah, I think, certainly the role of a good facilitator in a group context, a good coach in a group context, is to manage it and to help to create that sense of connection. I like to think about it in terms of connection versus in terms of chemistry, because I actually think that the role of connection, the function of connection is that connection begets chemistry, not the other way around. And that the skill of creating connection comes from this idea of conversation. I want to share in a minute a model on conversation, but I also want to just come to this idea of kind of a growth mindset around this idea of this creating the skill of connection, which is too often, particularly internal folks will say, I don't want this person in my program because they won't be able
Yeah,
to have that connection, and they
yeah.
won't be able to relate. And the truth is, with the proper training and coaching and support, sometimes the most unlikely people can be great mentors. And it looks like I'm sharing the wrong screen, so bear with me 1 second. Sorry about that.
I think that's very true. I think as you're sort of pulling that up, I mean, sometimes the people that surprise you are the ones that you think, we always say we love the skeptics coming into our group programs, because often they're the ones that they bring that skepticism, and then they really bring a dynamic conversation to the group, because you don't want group think, especially in a leadership type program that we do. You want
Yeah.
people to be bringing diverse points of view. So
Yep. So here's the model that I like to share. This was developed by Lois Zachary, who founded the center. And the idea here is that in coaching, you want to have good conversation. And that good conversation really is something that balances the learning and balances trust. And so, too often, and the old model of mentoring is this idea of monologue, which would be, in my day, this is how it was done. I walked, uphill both ways, and, this is how you need to do it. And the idea is that the learning is very low here. There's no trust here, and there's not really the sense of exchange. Then people say, well, we're not really in monologue. We're actually having an exchange, but what they might be having is more of a transaction, which would be the mentor or the coach saying, have you done this? Yes, check. It feels like a checklist, right? What are the items that we need to do? Check, 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 check. And it just becomes some sort of transaction. The next is sort of interaction, which is like a little bit more like a tennis game, right? Of, like I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, but there's not really learning, and you're not yet building trust, although there is more of an interactivity. Where you want to be, and where we help mentors develop to, because it's a two-way skill to have conversation, is this idea of collaborative engagement or dialogue. Collaborative engagement and dialogue are the stages where there's a deeper learning. Dialogue is where there's really learning really on both sides, but collaborative engagement is where the mentor engages so that the mentee can learn more. Maybe the mentor is sharing of their own past experience so that the mentee can have a learning. And there's really more reflection on that. And I want to also say there, I wish there was a kind of a fourth arrow we could put in here, which is this idea of time. Because you don't start in the area of collaborative engagement and dialogue, you aim to get there. And I think this is I just kind of raise this as a helpful model to think about, how are you developing chemistry and connection? You're doing it through good conversation. You're doing it by increasing the learning and building on the trust. And it truly is a skill and a competency that can be developed.
Yeah, and and I think I love this model, and it really parallels what happens in a good group coaching experience. It's the same thing. The first session that you have with a group, you're kind of building that psychological safety. It is more of a transactional exchange of, whether it's here's the goals I'm working on, oh, these are the goals you're working on. And you see as the group goes along, then the collaboration and the dialogue really shifts as they get comfortable with each other, as they realize their shared goals together. And also really, in a group coaching experience, very much I would think in the same way in a mentoring experience, there is this opportunity to collaborate on what the experience is going to look like. So we were just having a conversation, my colleague and I, this morning about a program that we're running. And because of COVID, everything's really gone sideways. And so the session that was planned for next week, we were talking about meeting the group where they are right now. And that's really the beauty of a coaching-based approach, is that you can really sort of step back and constantly reevaluate and be collaborative with the group participants around where did they want to take this. They own this learning, and how do you, help them move forward to where they need to be, given what's happening in their situation right now. So I love this model. It actually really parallels against a typical group coaching experience to open up the levels of conversation as well. It's great.
Yeah, it speaks also and to the point that you just made, Glyne, that speaks to the difference between training and these other modalities of coaching and mentoring, right? You don't have the same flexibility for co-creation and collaboration in a training as you do in a coaching and mentoring. And that's really kind of one of the beautiful things about it. I'm wondering, for the folks who are on the phone, if this model resonates with you at all, and how you might apply that to what you do. Just let us know in the chat. As with the last sessions, we really welcome your comments and dialogue.
I think it's interesting too, we talked last time a little bit about kind of the stages that relationships go through, and that arc really does kind of follow the stage of a mentoring relationship, as well as the mentor and mentee get more comfortable with each other, to your point about it going over time. And we find the same thing in a group program. I think I mentioned last week, and for those who weren't on the call last week, that for us, when we're group coaching, we often use session 3 as a bit of our litmus test to see if those deeper conversations are starting to happen, if those relationships are really starting to gel. It's one of our little check-in points, just to see how the group's forming together. So
yeah,
great parallels there. How
do you Jillian says, absolutely, I manage a one-on-one mentoring program and it applies to the different stages. Yeah, thanks. I think it might be helpful, Glyne, to just share with people, how do you balance the topical and the relevant in your group coaching? So, when you're talking about conversation, are you throwing in a topic for everybody to digest? What's the balance of sort of the teaching and the, and the conversation piece?
Yeah, it's interesting because we do it in a variety of ways. If I think of, and I would say there's a difference when you're virtual versus face-to-face. So when you have a bit more time, you can, often balance it a little differently. I would say in a standard face-to-face program, we like our programs to be 3 hours in length. So we're a bit of a short burst of learning, get in, get out, go do the work, right? So I always think of it like with group coaching, you're taking a flipped classroom approach. And so in a core session, the makeup of most of our core sessions are, let's say probably 1/3 of the time is spent on some kind of topic that is relevant for the group. And all of the topics get decided at 2 points in our program, because our program stretches over a year. So we have a topic that will, at the start of the program, there's, what are the leaders in the organization facing? What's the situation that's really required of them in terms of how they need to step up and lead? What are the gaps and opportunities for that very particular cohort of leaders? And that then shortlists a set of topics. So an example might be for high performing leaders that are getting promoted, we would look at some standard topics around understanding your values, understanding your strengths, and looking at your personal impact and brand. We map out those content pieces, and then midway through the program, we give the group actually the opportunity to decide what remaining topics they want to look at. So it's pretty dynamic, it's pretty just in time. You're about 6 months, you're halfway through the program at that point, so you want to be able to pivot and really bring in things that are relevant. So that's one component. And then the other component is peer coaching, where individuals can put out a real burning platform issue. And so in that particular aspect of the session, we'll run that every time in a 3-hour program, so they get lots and lots of practice building their coaching skills. But then there's always ways that you can, do different program designs where it's primarily a peer coaching experience, where it's just dealing with immediate relevant issues, or we've got programs that are probably more similar, I would think, Lisa, to maybe a group mentoring type approach, where it's a little bit more prescriptive, where mentors are taking smaller groups through a series of learning coaching topics and having facilitating discussion more around those topics. So we do both, and I think the mix is probably like a third or more, and then updating and closing, because we sort of bookend everything with accountability, just like any coaching program would be, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the accountability thing is absolutely key in a group mentoring. Actually, most often in group mentoring models, it's much more goal focused. Whereas in my experience in coaching, there's a topical, and then there's a burning platform, and then there's an accountability. In mentoring, it's accountability on goals, burning platform, and then accountability is sort of the structure. But it again varies a little bit. Occasionally people are wanting to introduce topics as well. So Glyne, any further thoughts on this idea of chemistry and conversation?
No, I mean, I think in all of the years that, running group sessions, we call it being voted off the island. I think the only time, because again, I'll go back to when I think it was at our first session where we really talked about like what some of the kind of core pillars of success are. And one of the things to mitigate things like chemistry being an issue is to have some very clear working agreements and ground rules with group participants. And so one of our strong ground rules is commitment, and commitment being you have to be at the sessions, and you have to show up at the sessions with your homework done and be ready to participate. And that's a very strong ground rule. And so we had one situation with one individual who missed, I think, 2 sessions in a row, and the group voted her off the island. That's how we would describe it. And, the timing wasn't good for her to be in the program. She needed to, focus on something else at that time. But I think that's the only time. But it was really the group's decision to do that. As the coach of that group, my job was to help them think through how they wanted to action it. So that's the other thing I really love about group coaching, really, is that you actually have these real experiences within groups, and we've had situations where somebody's broken confidentiality inadvertently, and the group has to give that individual feedback. And so you have these little things that come up in the experience of group coaching that also allow another level of learning for the participants to be able to do it. But chemistry has never really been the biggest deciding factor, because most people, when we launch programs like this, we actually give people an opt-out early on in the process. So if it's really not for them, they know it's not for them, and they're not going to come into the process. And that's usually mostly to do with time commitment, and then expectation around how we do our goal setting around behavior goals in the program. So having chemistry is a big stumbling block, to be honest.
I agree. And in the times when I've done group coaching as well, one of the benefits of being a trained coach is that you can use some of your coaching skills to help, so I'm sure you've had this experience, and I'm sure others have as well, where there's a group dynamic where somebody's just an external processor. I'm guilty of the external processing. And so they tend to hog up airtime.
Yeah.
And sometimes the group will give feedback, and sometimes as a coach, you can pick up the phone or reach out afterwards and say, wanted to just share with you, you had great stuff, here's some tips, and you can provide just a little bit of guidance. And we've been able to turn around quite a few group dynamics just by providing that. And if a skilled coach can do it in a way that doesn't feel critical, but feels really constructive, I think.
Well, and I think, you know, what you're hitting on there too, which is something that I think is such an advantage for organizations that are trying to shift behavior, is to take this kind of group coach approach or one-to-one mentoring approach when we're talking about behavioral shift. Because as a coach in that situation, often what I find fascinating is that individuals will get their 360 feedback and they'll say, no, I don't talk too much. I don't know why that came up on my 360 score. I've never, no, I've been working on this. I'm not an over talker, da, da, da. And then as a coach, you see them in the context of the group. And so when you have your, you know, we have a program where people have their group coaching, but they also have some individual coaching. And so as a coach, it is so powerful to be able to say, okay, so let's go back and circle back on that behavior that you didn't think was really accurate on your 360. Can I share with you what I observed in that group session, or what I've been observing in the group sessions, how this is coming across? Because what I find about, particularly when people are trying to move a behavior, is that it's often very subtle, and it's often things that are extremely attached to their strength. So they don't know how to unbundle, you know, the fact that this is actually a dark side of their strength that they have. And so I do find when you do the group piece, you get to see it in context, and it makes the coaching experience all the more powerful for the individual. So
Yeah, for sure.
big advantage there.
All right. Well, let's shift a little bit into this idea of goal sharing, goal setting. We've, you know, one of the questions that's come up over the last week is this idea of sort of vulnerability, generally, goal setting more specifically, when people are working with a new behavior. Like, is it challenging for people to be vulnerable and share what their goal is, and how do you go about the goal setting process? So I've got a little bit of a framework I want to share. I know you do as well. And
I thought this was such a good question, because I think people, and especially when we get into leaders, I think often people assume that leaders are going to be uncomfortable sharing their, you know, quote, not my words, but somebody else's words, shortcomings. So I thought that was it's a great place to talk about.
So in the mentoring context, we use a SMART goal framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the idea of forming, you know, specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound goals. And rather than sharing that with all of you, because so many are familiar with that framework, I just wanted to share the context in which we teach our mentors how to support their mentees. And I'd be curious, Glyne, how you would see this in the coaching realm. Is this idea that it is the job of mentors to provide support for their mentees, to help mentees clarify and develop their career vision, and to challenge their mentees. And so when they're looking in the realm of, when they're in the process of determining goals with their mentee, and in the mentoring context, it's really important to recognize that the goal creation process is a co-creation. They're mutually agreed goals that focus on the mentee's skills and development. And the reason for that is you do want the mentor to bring their expertise and feedback on what the goal is, and to have, you know, horse in the running, right? To have some stake in the game of what that goal is. So when we talk to mentors about how to support their mentees, and when we talk to mentees about how to seek support from their mentors, we remind them of these roles of providing support, clarifying vision, and really challenging their mentee. A good goal in mentoring is not one that keeps you comfortable. It's really one that stretches you and pushes you out. And so we spend a lot of time with mentors separately and mentees separately, asking mentors, what specific things can you do to support your mentee, to help them clarify their vision and to challenge them, and spend a lot of time with mentees saying, how can you ask for what you need in support, vision, and challenge, particularly when it comes to the goal setting process. So when mentees come in and say, I don't actually know what my goals are, we say that's perfectly okay. This process of between SMART goal setting and looking at support, vision, and challenge can really be quite instrumental in getting you to a good goal. So what reaction do you have to that?
I love that. I mean, I guess I have a question for you. I mean, do you ever find that mentees get a little uncomfortable with the thought of having to share a goal with their mentor, or how do you mitigate that? Because I've certainly heard sometimes people who have been part of internal mentoring programs will say to me, well, I've got my goals, but I'm not going to tell my mentor my real goals because I don't want them to think that I'm not capable of X, Y, or Z. Like, curious, like how you, if you've encountered that, and if you have, how you've overcome that in the conversations with the mentors and or the mentees.
Yeah, it shows up in lots of different ways. So we've seen that for sure at the outset. And a lot of times this happens by people who really are sort of those quick starts, who want to just dive right in and get to goals right away. And you'll remember last time I shared this model of mentoring, which has the preparation phase before the negotiation phase, before the enabling growth phase. And that's really the reason why is, collaboration can only really happen in an environment of safety and trust. And again, that takes time. So anytime I hear that happen, my radar goes up and I say, you really haven't spent enough time in the trust building phase of your relationship yet. And so my advice is always to go back there. The other piece is there's a differentiation between a mentor and a sponsor. And it's really important. A sponsor is somebody for whom the protege, right? A sponsor is matched with a protege, a mentor is matched with a mentee. A sponsor is somebody for whom the protege really wants to show up as their best. And that is, I don't want to say understandable, because if somebody feels that way, it's always understandable. But it's a little more easy to reckon why somebody might want to show up and not share a vulnerable goal with the sponsor, because the sponsor is advocating and providing access and visibility. A mentor is quite different. A mentor is a developmental relationship. And so, and safety and trust is certainly very important in the sponsoring relationship as well. But in the mentoring relationship, it's essential. And the mentor must ensure that they are also having some vulnerability and sharing their own struggles to make the mentee more comfortable. Because though the mentee drives the relationship, the mentor drives the tone.
Mm-hmm. I think that is so key. I think that what you just hit on there to me is so key, because I think I've been in organizations and I've worked with people who've had mentors where it is much more hierarchical. The mentor is sort of, that old, in training, we call it the sage on the stage, the expert at the front of the room, kind of an approach. And I think what you're saying is absolutely the way to kind of overcome that as a potential challenge within a relationship. I need to feel that you've walked in my shoes as well if I'm a mentee, right? Yeah. And that you're sharing with me kind of the hardships and the struggles you've had and what's worked for you, and so that I can feel comfortable sharing where I feel short. Because we also tell ourselves stories, right, about how this information is going to be used in organizations. So critical that we set the right foundation for mentees and mentors when they go into a program like this.
Yeah.
I love this though. I mean, it's very similar to, if I think just overall in the difference for the group coaching is that the group is doing this with each other, right? They're supporting each other. So the ground rules of how are you going to support each other against this goal that the person is setting? How can we help you? And so often in our group programs, they're always paired with a peer partner. And one of the activities that they'll often do, because for us, the goal setting piece in our programs, it's always twofold. One piece is always hey, what are you trying to move the needle on in this year for your career development? And it could, for some people, an example might be, I've got to rebuild my team, or I've got to, learn how to navigate this new department that I've just taken over and build my alliances and, all of the kind of things that might come into goals, around the role. But they always have a behavioral goal. And it's that behavioral goal piece that, their learning partner can really help them with, because, as a coach, you see them in action in the group session, but it's really when they're day to day. And so they can be partnered up with somebody who sees them in the meetings and can say to them at the end of the meeting, yes, I saw you do this, and challenge them and do all of those, those other pieces that are kind of part of your model, which is very parallel, I find.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Also, it's important, it helps keep central the main thing and keep you accountable to outcomes. So, it's so easy to get caught up in the burning fires, right? The burning platforms, as you say, right? And that the tools that you get from learning how to fight those fires can be really useful, but it's the outcomes are not as measurable. And the satisfaction doesn't become as tangible unless you're really focusing on, as you call them, behavioral goals or learning goals. Let's look at your goal setting model, shall we? I think it's really helpful for folks to take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, so our specialty area is really helping leaders shift behavior, because they have to, whatever the situation that they're adapting to, as Marshall Goldsmith, my mentor, would say, what got you here would not get you there. You now have to do something else. And what I've learned over the years, especially working with, we tend to work with that type A, high achiever personality type. And what happens is they get promoted based on the strengths of their approach. And so then when they jump into a new situation, it's not so much that they need to develop something, they actually need to learn how to soften down that strength, because what's attached to every strength is a liability. And if you overuse a strength, like overusing a muscle, it's not going to work for you. So what we have a model that we developed called the CC model, and it stands for create clarity, enroll others, create an action plan, and implement and follow up. And what you see sitting behind that is really the learning journey that we all go through. And what I like to say about behavior, we're all, we all kind of live in oblivion about how our behavior impacts other people until we have, in our case, usually people get a 360 review and they get their 360 results and they go, what do you mean people don't see me as strategic? Or what do you mean people don't see me as collaborative as I should be, or as consensual as I should be? And so they go from that unconsciously incompetent box there in the upper left down to suddenly becoming very conscious of this incompetence. But that's often where it stops for people. Or what they choose to do, because our brains like to do this, is that they choose to embrace the strength and ignore the weakness. Well, yes, I know I'm a bit of a bull in a china shop, but I get results. I can push people through to the finish line. And so with our program, what we really do is we get people to get real clarity on what we call the big bang for the buck behavior, because behaviors don't work in isolation. If you start working on something, it's going to affect your approach to a number of other things in a positive way. So the first thing we'll do with people is we will help them create real clarity on what is the behavior that they need to make a move on. If I'll use an example of, somebody I coached for a while, who was in one of our programs, and she was seen as intimidating. So what was, everybody talked about her being intimidating. She was incredibly direct. She was very assertive. She got the job done. She'd been promoted very, very quickly, but people said that she wasn't approachable. And that was the feedback that she was getting. You're intimidating, you're not approachable. And so she really didn't know what to do with that feedback, because she didn't see herself that way. Her own self-image was very different than that. So couldn't see how she was showing up, didn't really understand how that was impacting people. So one of the ways to create clarity for her was to really kind of dig in and kind of land on a behavior that was going to help her move the needle on that. So what she was overusing in that situation was her competitiveness. There wasn't a fight that she didn't love to win. And so the behavior that she kind of anchored in on was to be more consensual. So to get more input from other people and to help really, be seen as somebody who was more involving and more collaborative. And so enrolling others for us is about not her deciding on her own, I'm going to involve more people, but we used the technique feed forward that Marshall Goldsmith has popularized, where she had to go to all of her stakeholders, all of her key stakeholders that she wanted to shift this behavior with, and get their best suggestion on what she was going to do. And then from there, when she had all those suggestions, she could create an action plan. And what we do in the action planning process is get people to get very specific. And the new buzzword now is micro behaviors. Well, that's what we've been using for the last 10 years, is micro behaviors, small little things that she could do in meetings with people to be really intentional. And that's really the I in the CC model, is intentionality. Where are you going to show up using this behavior, with who, when, for what purpose? And that becomes the plan that everybody in our program follows to really start moving the needle on behavior. And so it kind of keeps cycling through, because you implement the behavior and then you have to get clarity. Am I doing the right behavior? Have I swung the pendulum too far? And in fact, it's normal for people to do that. Like I remember with that client, she then stopped telling people what to do, and she was asking everybody everything. What do you think about this? What do you think about? And then people were saying, could you just make a decision? So she'd sort of taken it too far the other way. And so, people need help kind of right sizing it. But the enrollment of other people around an individual who's working on a behavior is mission critical. If you do not have that, my experience has been that the individual will not be seen as making any change, because our brains are so wired to keep people in that pigeonhole. So part of the process of enrolling other people on the journey is so that they will start looking for that new behavior proactively. And the individuals that are, sharing their goals with their peers, sharing their goals with their direct reports, sharing their goals with their boss, part of the method to that madness is to bring people along so people are on board and seeing the new stuff and letting the old tapes go. Because I always say, there's all those kinds of old tapes about you in your organization, and you have to erase those tapes. But you muscling through and doing it on your own is not going to get you there. So the CC model is the platform that we use to help leaders create really concrete and actionable behavioral goals. But we're also, as you can see in it, dragging other people in the organization along on the journey so that there's a greater chance of sustainability and it actually sticking.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I love the overlay of this on the unconsciously competent, incompetent to journey to unconsciously competent as well. What do you see as sort of the main ingredient to success in making this work in the coaching context?
Yeah, I mean, the main ingredient is, well, frankly, the person actually doing the work and being intentional. Like, I think what happens is people think that I have to have this behavior and I have to demonstrate it all over the place. And in fact, you don't. And what I've learned over the years is what you think is, because often people will push back when it's around behavior change. They'll say, but that's not me. That's inauthentic to me. And I value authenticity, and I don't want to, have to demonstrate, behavior that doesn't feel authentic to me. And I think the thing about that, there's two pieces to that. One, when you're hired to do a job, you're hired not only on what you have to do, but how you have to do it. And this is what this is about. This is you stepping up to the how. So if your boss is saying, I need you to be more collaborative and open-minded, that's part of your job description. You're going to have to learn how to do that. The second piece is, when we're in that consciously competent phase, that's when it feels really uncomfortable, because we're really being planful. We're thinking, okay, I'm about to go into a meeting with Lisa. I'm not going to speak for the first 15 minutes because I'm going to be listening and asking Lisa questions because I'm demonstrating being open-minded. If your natural go-to is to go in and boss everybody around, you're going to have to really think about doing that and do that with intention. And that can feel really uncomfortable with people. I always say to people, you're probably always going to have an element of conscious competence when a behavior is very counter to how you're naturally wired. There are parts of my behavior that I constantly have to just be aware of. But you know what? I've gotten much better over the years, and it's now become more of a go-to immediately for me on the vast majority of things. And that's what we're really looking to help people dial up towards here. It's progress, not perfection, when it comes to that type of goal, but it is about really small, actionable steps that you can take and that you reflect on every day that help you move the needle.
Yeah, I want to invite the folks who are on to ask us any questions about the goal setting process. You can do that either in Q&A or the chat. And while you're thinking of your questions, Glenn, I wanted to just throw out a question that I got recently from a coaching client on this exact topic of kind of like practicing a new competency. And what he asked me, or what he said was, we were talking about his need to demonstrate more empathy. And he said, I'm just not an empathetic person. It feels fake. It feels like what I'm being asked to do and the skill I'm being asked to develop isn't something that's authentic to me, and I'm playing a part. And I'm wondering if that's something that's come up in the coaching context for you, and how that might relate to all of this, what you might tell that person.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but I think this is where, what does he need to do to demonstrate empathy, right? So it could be as simple as asking his team members how their weekend was and genuinely listening for 5 minutes. Demonstrating empathy could mean walking down the hallway and pausing to say hello to people on his way to the office. Empathy could mean asking check-in questions more frequently. If he had a little toolkit of small things like that and then just decided, I'm going to pick one of those things and I'm going to do it in this situation with this person, my guess is he would be hugely surprised at how just a very small thing is going to have people thinking that he is demonstrating more empathy. My experience has been when people do these things, that like anybody who comes into me and says, oh, but that's not me and it doesn't feel like me and I'm not da da da. When they do the small thing and they realize how small it is and how by just doing a little makes a big impact, it feels much easier. It feels much easier for people. It doesn't have to be something huge.
For sure. And what's interesting to me is, I really encourage to think of it like a skill, right? Think of it like learning how to, do something mechanical on your car, or, I don't know, draw calligraphy or whatever. You're not faking it that you don't know. You're in the developmental stage of growing. So those are great tips. So Leah asked a great question. She says, can you provide a few examples of check-in questions, trying to move away from, how are things going? Great question.
What do you do in the mentoring program? Do you give mentors some specific check-ins?
We do. Well, we have different kinds of check-in questions, right? So the most typical one is, the small talk is, how are you? And then the next question is, how are you really?
Are you
And
really,
sometimes
really?
the next question is, how are you really, really? This works particularly well now.
Yeah.
But, we also do power questions. So, and you can get them, Leah, if you want to just go to our website, centerformentoring.com, you can type your email in, and that's actually one of the things that we just send to people for free. So there's 25 power questions. You can just type your email in there. But we do power questions, and power questions are things like, what's an ideal day? What's present for you right now? What's keeping you up at night? Those kind of things. And having both people ask and answer them is really important. Then that's the one side on the relationship piece. The other piece of check-in questions is on the learning piece. And there is a piece of check-in that's about accountability. And one of the things, I think I mentioned it last time, if not, I mentioned it on our first session together, is this idea of, at the end of each session, what were your takeaways and commitments? And by the way, mentor and mentee can have takeaways and commitments. And then using that as an entree after this initial kind of relationship piece to check in and have accountability. So there's checking in on accountability and goals, and there's checking in on relationship. Both are really important. So Leah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, and we do similar. I mean, with the group coaching, because you're working with often 8 leaders and you need to have it pretty standardized, right, in terms of what you're doing on that accountability piece, we do the same thing. And we have kind of a standard template that we get everybody to fill out. And the questions that we use on that are certainly update, progress you're making against your goal. But we always like to ask, what have you learned that you would like to share with the group? What are you most proud of? And then for us, because we're going into a group session on topics or themes, would be what do you want to gain from this conversation today? So that's something that they do ahead of a session to really kind of get clear on what they're coming in with. And I love in learning because all the groups that we do are peer groups, and so asking questions about what they're proud of and what they've learned from their actions really contributes to group learning too. So there's places that you can pull out what everybody can kind of build off of. And then on to Lisa's point, power questions, that is another great way if you want to kind of put some energy into groups. We often will start with a one-word buzz. It's a very simple exercise check-in, but using I'm a trained Edward de Bono 6 thinking hats person, and so we'll start with what's called the red hat, which is the emotion hat. And how are you feeling? So one word around the table, how's the group feeling? I love doing that with groups because you can, usually when a group gets together, I will tell you, especially these days, the feeling words that I hear at the start of the session are things like exhausted, overwhelmed, depleted. Especially, I have a number of groups right now that are working parents and, trying to work from home in the middle of a pandemic with little kids running around. And then what's fascinating to me is to do that same exercise as you close off the group and to see the energy shift. And that becomes another teachable moment for a group to say, hey, well, you pulled yourself out of this and you're now in this experience, and look at how we've moved the needle on energy. So it's so important for us to replenish and step back and reflect, because my observation of most individuals today is they're just flat out running, right? So there's always great teachable moments when you do these kind of check-ins, start and end of group sessions often.
Yeah, that exercise in itself can be developmental.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes, particularly I found, when I work with tech or engineering groups, that wearing that feeling hat is something that's very foreign and something that they're often getting feedback. And this is, that's absolutely an archetype and not fact. But a lot of times what they're getting from their people is that they're not as in touch with feelings. So getting them to wear that feeling hat can be really, really
that's like going back to your example of your gentleman who doesn't have empathy. I mean, he could implement that exercise alone at a team meeting, just to start to juice up his own kind of awareness around where people are feeling and how they're feeling and that type of thing, right? So this to me is the example of things don't have to be really big to be super high impact.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, what other questions do folks have before we move on here?
Yeah, in the last 5 minutes, what else do you want to know from Lisa and I?
Well, I'll tell you, I loved that you called it the CC model. That my favorite dish at my favorite restaurant is called chechi, spelled the same way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's deep fried chickpeas, and it's spectacular.
Oh, really?
So, yes, now I'm going to start to call them order the CCs instead of the chechis.
Yeah, the enrolling others is probably the most critical part of that model, let me tell you, because I think I remember doing it with my team a few years ago. I got my 360 results and I'd come out really low on feedback. And I can remember being shocked because I've never been low on feedback in my life, but we were running the business virtually at that stage and didn't have dedicated office space. So everything was being delivered on the fly. And one of my colleagues, so I did feed forward, enrolling them to say, okay, what should my plan be to move the needle on this feedback piece? And one of the suggestions I got was to use emojis in my emails, because most of the time I was, zipping around and firing off this very quick feedback message, and people weren't understanding the emotion behind it. Was I mad? Was I happy? Was I, upset about stuff? And I can honestly say that I never would have considered putting emojis in my emails. I am over the age of 35, so it must have not come naturally to put in emojis. But that's the point of having other people tell you what they need from you.
Yeah,
and doing it as opposed to trying to guess, the behavior that I need to show up with, right?
Yeah, interesting, right? So Leah asked a great question. She says, in this virtual world, work from home, when team members absolutely will not use their camera, any tips for creating connection or drawing them out in conversation? What thoughts do you have?
I make people use their camera. It's a non-negotiable. It's one of my ground rules. So I would probably dial up the red energy on ground rules at the start with group, and why. Like I think when you explain why to people, my experience has been that they're more open to it. And then breakout rooms, if you use Zoom, getting into smaller rooms, often you could start there and then bring people back together. So those would be other techniques to kind of create those conversations. I love Zoom breakout rooms. We pair people off, we bring them even in small groups of 8. We're using that technology really all the time. How about you, Lisa?
Yeah, I have a couple different answers for that. Sometimes it's just not possible, right? You've got particularly kids running around or what have you. And so I like to say, don't make perfect communication be the enemy of the good. If that's all you got, that's all you got. But I do think we do try to set those ground rules at the beginning. The other piece is to use tools in your conversation for sharing. So, sometimes we have a virtual ball right? Where I might kind of pass the ball to Glyne and say, you know, or if we have a group, you know, say, all right, who are you passing the ball to? And so you might start with it. We're going to start the ball off with Joe, and Joe has his camera off, right? So Joe still has to participate, right? You might say, Joe, you know, can you turn, when you speak, could you turn your camera on, or something like that? There's a little bit of negotiation piece there. You know, and the other piece is take time, particularly if you're talking about group coaching and group mentoring, that those connection points at the beginning are really important for drawing people out. So whether it's a power question, whether it's something, you know, lighter or sillier, and I call it silly not in a pejorative way, but with, you know, like you can change, I'm pointing to my screen, you can change the name on your, you know, you can have people say today, I'm going to do it here. How are you feeling today? And you can see on my screen, I just changed my name to exhausted, right? Or, you know, maybe something a little more positive than
on that happy note.
you know, or what was your reaction? Who saw, you know, what's your one reaction to Game of Thrones last night, or whatever? You know, you could find some fun way to draw people out, and build in the lightness and the fun is a really good way to do that. But passing the ball and having this expectation of participation, a lot of times you'll have the person who has their camera off also has you know, is muted or what have you. And so you really want to be able to draw them out in one way or the other. So it's an important, important question, Leah. Thank you.
Yeah. And next week, one of our plans for our next session, and I think we're probably coming up to the hour now. So for next week's session, we were going to touch on some of the tips and tricks for virtual that we're exploring and discovering, because I think we're all sort of, you know, navigating this new space together. So we've got a few, you know, I think Lisa and I are both learning some lessons ourselves, and we're going to look at ways that, you know, coaching and mentoring programs maybe deliver some results that we weren't always expecting, right? So, you know, I think sometimes the mentor gets more out of the mentoring relationship than the mentee. And in other cases, and certainly in group coaching, my experience has been that the groups often get more than they bargain for when they come together and learn from each other. So that's what we'll be doing next week.
Great. Well, I saw we missed two things in the Q&A. Alfred, power questions you can get from the Center for Mentoring website. Also, and just type your email in and it'll show up in your inbox. Glyne, will you share your goals slide with folks if they want?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. If you want to email me, I think my email's on the screen there, groberts@roundtable.com. So just shoot me an email and I'm happy to send you that framework.
Yep. And then in terms of people being hesitant to display their home, you know, the virtual background is great for that. Both Glyne and I have non-virtual backgrounds, but you know, encouraging people to do virtual background can be helpful too. Sometimes you get part of your head cut off, but it's certainly better if they don't want to show their background. So thank you all for participating. We are looking forward to seeing you next week. You can email either of us in the meantime, and we will see you then. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the questions.